The discovery was made in the summer of 1978, during the demolition of an old mercantile building in Van Buren, Missouri, a town that clings to the banks of the current river like a memory refusing to fade. Workmen had been hired to clear the site for a new county annex, and as they tore through the rotted floorboards of what had once been the back office, one of them, a young man named Harley Ponder, noticed something wedged between the foundation stones. It was a leather-bound ledger, water-stained and warped, its pages stuck together with the residue of half a century of damp and neglect. He almost threw it away. But something made him pull the pages apart. And when he did, he found the handwriting. Small, precise, almost feminine in its care, and utterly damning. Page after page of names. Dates. Payments. Transactions that had no place in the ordinary accounting of a general store. It was, in effect, a catalog of murder. The ledger eventually made its way to the Carter County Historical Society, where it was stored in a box and forgotten for another 40 years. It wasn't until an archivist named Margaret Stubblefield began cataloging unsorted donations in 2021 that anyone truly examined it. By then, the ink had faded to a brown so pale it was nearly illegible. But under ultraviolet light, the names emerged. Elijah Pugh. Silas Dowd. The Hale family, father, mother, 3 children. Mary Beth Crenshaw, age 19. All recorded with dates next to them. Dates of death, she would later realize. And beside each name, a sum of money. $50. 75. Occasionally 100. The ledger was a death list. And the man who kept it was named Orville F. Beckwith. Orville F. Beckwith was, by all accounts, an unremarkable man. He was born in 1843, somewhere in the hills of eastern Tennessee, to parents whose names have been lost to time. He came to Missouri after the Civil War, like so many others, a man with no past, or at least no past he cared to discuss. He settled in the tiny community of Chalk Bluff, a few miles north of Van Buren, and opened a general store. It was a modest operation: flour, salt, bolts of calico, coffee beans, ammunition, the occasional bottle of patent medicine. Farmers came down from the hills to trade for supplies, and Beckwith kept their accounts in a ledger with a neat, steady hand. His neighbors described him as quiet. A man who kept to himself. Attended church irregularly, never caused trouble, paid his debts on time. He was the sort of man who fades into the background of a room, the sort you would not remember meeting even if you had spoken to him twice. Which, of course, made him perfect for the work he was doing. The work that would eventually make him, for a brief and terrible period, one of the most powerful men in southern Missouri. The work for which he would never be charged, never be tried, never even be publicly accused. The work that he took to his grave in 1891, buried in an unmarked plot in a cemetery that no longer exists. Because Orville F. Beckwith was not merely a storekeeper. He was the keeper of the ledger. And the ledger was the accounting system for an organization that had no official name, no written charter, no legal existence. An organization that operated in the shadows of the Ozark Hills, dispensing its own brand of justice and, more often than not, simply dispensing death. To understand what Beckwith was doing, you have to understand the world he was living in. It is 1875. The Civil War ended 10 years ago, but in the Ozarks, the war has never truly ended. This is a landscape of deep, shadowed hollows, where families have feuded for generations and where the line between law and lawlessness has been blurred by the passage of armies that cared nothing for either. During the war, southern Missouri was a place of unimaginable violence, guerrilla bands and Union patrols and bushwhackers who answered to no one, moving through the hills like ghosts, burning farms and shooting men in their own dooryards. The fighting was not organized, it was personal. It was about loyalty, about territory, about debts that could only be settled in blood. And when the war ended, the violence did not stop. It simply changed form. What replaced it was a kind of chaos that the government in Jefferson City was too weak to control. The official courts were distant, expensive, often corrupt. The local sheriffs were frequently in the pockets of the men they were supposed to be arresting. In the absence of any reliable system of justice, the people of the hills began to create their own. In Taney County, just to the west, they became known as the Bald Knobbers, vigilantes who wore horned masks made of calfskin and met on the bald summits of the hills to plan their raids. They terrorized the countryside, and in 1889, the state would move against them, hanging several of their leaders. But in Carter County, where Beckwith lived, the structure was different. It was quieter, more methodical, and far more secret. We do not know what the group called itself. The ledger does not give it a name. The few surviving letters from the period refer to it only as the Committee, or sometimes the Society. It was a shadow government that operated in the spaces between towns, its members drawn from the wealthy landowners and merchants who had grown tired of the chaos and decided to restore order on their own terms. They met in the back rooms of stores, in the offices of mills, in the parlors of the big houses that sat on the bluffs overlooking the river. They were businessmen. They were farmers. They were, in some cases, the same men who served on the county grand jury. And they controlled everything. Orville Beckwith was their accountant. The ledger that Harley Ponder found is the single most important document to survive from this period. It contains the names of 47 people. 47 souls who disappeared from Carter County between 1875 and 1889. Most are men, but there are women as well. In at least 4 cases, the entire family was accounted for: husband, wife, children. The dates are precise. So are the payments. Beckwith received between $50 and $100 for each name. The payments were recorded as if they were ordinary transactions: credit extended, debts paid, goods delivered. But the goods were bodies. And the debts were blood. Consider the case of Elijah Pugh. Pugh was a farmer who lived on a small holding in the eastern part of the county. He had a wife and 3 children. In the summer of 1878, a neighbor accused him of stealing horses. The accusation was never proved. There was no warrant, no arrest, no trial. But on the night of August 17, 1878, 5 men arrived at Pugh's cabin. They dragged him from his bed, marched him into the woods, and shot him twice in the back of the head. His body was found 3 days later, partially eaten by hogs. The coroner's jury ruled it a suicide. In the ledger, Beckwith recorded the payment, $75. The payer's name was not given, but the county records show that the neighbor who had accused Pugh of horse theft came into a significant sum of money around the same time, enough to purchase 300 acres of Pugh's former land. There was no investigation. No one was ever charged. But Pugh's widow, a woman named Caroline, knew the truth. She wrote a letter to the governor, dated October 12, 1878, in which she named the men she believed to be responsible. The letter was received and acknowledged, but nothing was done. She died in poverty 5 years later. Her children were scattered to orphanages and distant relatives. The land was sold. The family line ended. This is not a story about the Wild West. This is not the legend of Billy the Kid or the gunfight at the OK Corral. This is something far darker, far more methodical, an organized system of murder that operated for nearly a decade and a half, under the very nose of the official government, with the complicity, and in some cases the direct participation, of the very men charged with upholding the law. It is a story that has been almost entirely forgotten, buried beneath the convenient fiction that the frontier was a place of clear moral divisions, good men in white hats, bad men in black, and justice always, eventually, served. It was not that simple. It was never that simple. The society, for want of a better name, was not interested in justice. It was interested in order. And order, in the fractured world of Reconstruction-era Missouri, was something that could only be enforced by fear. The members of the society were the county's economic elite, the men who owned the land, the men who controlled the credit, the men who could decide whether a neighbor lived or died with a quiet word in the right ear. They were the men who had survived the chaos of the war, and they were determined that the peace that followed would be shaped by their will. They used the deep divisions that the war had created, the old loyalties and resentments that still simmered beneath the surface of daily life, to justify their campaign. Their victims, they said, were the troublemakers. The criminals. The men who had refused to accept the new order. But the ledger tells a different story. The names recorded in its pages are not the names of hardened outlaws. They are the names of ordinary people who had, in one way or another, become inconvenient. Elijah Pugh had a water right that a more powerful neighbor wanted. Silas Dowd was a former Union soldier who refused to forget the things he had seen during the war, things that implicated some of the county's most prominent men in war crimes. The Hale family had a son who was rumored to be romantically involved with a white woman, a crime in the eyes of the society's members, who considered themselves the guardians of racial purity in the hills. Mary Beth Crenshaw was a woman who had the audacity to refuse the advances of a wealthy local merchant. She disappeared one night, walking home from a church social. Her body was found in a shallow grave on the merchant's property, but no one ever investigated. After all, she was just a girl. What was she worth? In the ledger, she is worth $75. The merchant's payment is listed just below her name. This is also a story about America. About the Reconstruction era, that brief and tragic window when the federal government attempted to remake the South in the image of racial equality, and about the violent reaction that followed. The Ozarks were not the Deep South, but the same currents of resentment and reaction were at work here. The Republican Party had been in control during Reconstruction, but that control was increasingly tenuous, dependent on federal troops that were being withdrawn. In Missouri, the Democrats were slowly reclaiming power, driven by a coalition of former Confederates and conservative Unionists who had grown weary of the costs of social change. The Society's reign of terror was part of that reclamation, a way to terrorize the local population into silence, to remind them that the old ways were not dead. When the 1874 gubernatorial election in Arkansas erupted into the Brooks-Baxter War, fought between two Republican factions over who had the right to claim the governor's mansion, it sent shockwaves through the entire region. The chaos in Little Rock seemed to prove that Reconstruction was failing, that the federal government was powerless to enforce its will, that local authority, by any means necessary, was the only guarantee of stability. Men like Beckwith looked at the violence across the border and saw an opportunity. If the regular government could not maintain order, they would do it themselves. The name Lake County War might echo in this period as well, though it happened in Colorado, not Missouri. A personal dispute over water rights spiraled into vigilante terror, with a committee of safety driving out its enemies, murdering a judge in his own courtroom, and ultimately becoming the county's de facto government. The pattern was the same: ordinary disputes escalating into extra-legal violence, vigilantes organizing themselves into quasi-official bodies, and the legal system either too weak or too complicit to stop them. In Colorado, the violence ended when the territorial government stepped in. In Missouri, the violence ended only when the Society's victims were all dead, and the survivors were too afraid to speak. Beckwith, for his part, was never suspected. He was a quiet man, a reliable clerk, a steady hand with a ledger. He had a wife named Emmeline and 3 children, none of whom survived to adulthood. The tax records show that he was moderately prosperous, living comfortably but not ostentatiously. He attended the Methodist Church on Sundays. He wore plain, dark clothes. He spoke rarely, and when he did, he spoke softly. He was the kind of man you would trust with your accounts. And, of course, people did. That was the point. The ledger was hidden, not because Beckwith was ashamed of it, but because it was evidence. If the wrong people ever discovered what he had been doing, his life would be over. So he kept it in the back room, where no one would ever look, under a loose floorboard in the corner. He would have taken it with him when he died, but he died suddenly, a heart attack, the doctor said, and he had no time to destroy it. His widow, Emmeline, did not know it was there. She sold the store to a younger man, who used the building for storage and then abandoned it altogether. And there the ledger stayed, slowly rotting, waiting for someone to find it. The names are the key. 47 names, recorded in a hand so careful it almost seems respectful. But respect is not what Beckwith felt. He felt nothing, or he felt only the cold satisfaction of a job well done. The entries in the ledger are precise: dates, sums, the occasional notation. Sometimes a location is given: hollow, branch, ford, or a circumstance: ran, fell, fight. These are euphemisms, code words for execution. Ran means shot while fleeing. Fell means shot in the back. Fight means beaten to death before the shot, or sometimes after. The ledger does not judge. It only records. Among the names is that of a man called Joseph Pugh, a farmer whose family had lived in the county since before the war. Pugh had a reputation for being independent, not easily swayed by threats or bribes. He had refused to join the society when it was formed, and he had spoken openly against its methods. On the night of October 23, 1880, two men arrived at his cabin and asked to speak with him. His wife, Sarah, said that he went outside to meet them, and she heard a single shot. When she went to the door, her husband was dead, and the men were gone. The coroner ruled it a suicide. No one questioned the ruling. Sarah Pugh wrote a letter to the local newspaper, which was never published. She died in 1898, and her children moved away. The land was absorbed into the holdings of the merchant who had ordered the killing. The payment in the ledger is $100, the highest sum recorded, a reflection of the importance of the victim. The society's power was not limited to murder. They controlled the courts, the banks, the land offices. They decided who could buy and sell. They decided who could vote and who could hold office. They operated through a network of informants and enforcers, men who were willing to do what they were told without asking questions. Some of those men were paid. Others were simply grateful for the protection that the society offered, a kind of security in a world that had no safety at all. And yet, for all their power, the society was never secure. They lived in constant fear of exposure, of arrest, of the federal authorities who might one day decide to investigate. That fear kept them careful. It kept them quiet. It kept them from making the mistakes that had doomed the bald knobbers, who had been too open, too theatrical, too willing to be seen. The society learned from those mistakes. They operated in the shadows. They left no trace. Except, of course, for the ledger. The discovery of Beckwith's ledger in 1978 should have been a sensation. It was the single most important document ever found in the history of the Ozarks, a complete record of an organized campaign of murder, kept by a man who had never been suspected of anything more than keeping accounts. But the ledger was not recognized for what it was. The archivist who first examined it thought it was a store ledger, nothing more. It was placed in a box and forgotten. It was not until Margaret Stubblefield began her work in 2021 that anyone understood what they were looking at. Stubblefield was a meticulous researcher, the kind of woman who read old newspapers for the pleasure of it, who could identify a 19th-century script at a glance. She had been working for the Carter County Historical Society for nearly 30 years, and she had never seen anything like the ledger. The handwriting was neat, almost obsessively so. The entries were arranged chronologically, with no apparent gaps. And the names were all familiar to her. She had seen them before, in the local histories, in the genealogies that families had compiled over the generations. They were the names of people who had simply vanished, whose deaths had never been adequately explained. She began to cross-reference the ledger with other records, census returns, tax assessments, land records, newspaper accounts. What she found was shocking. Of the 47 names in the ledger, not a single one had been the subject of a successful investigation. In every case, the death had been ruled accidental, or natural, or suicide. In several cases, no death certificate existed at all, the person had simply disappeared, never to be heard from again. The families had known the truth, but they had been too afraid to speak. And with each passing generation, the truth had grown fainter, the memories more vague, until the people in the ledger were no longer people but names on a page. The society had been remarkably thorough. They had killed not just their victims but the memory of their victims. And they had done it with the acquiescence of the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. The sheriff in 1878 was a man named Hiram Fetter. He was also a member of the society. The coroner in 1882 was a man named Amos Crenshaw. He was another member. The judge who presided over the county court in the 1880s, a man named Wiley Pratt, had been elected with the society's support, and he had never once issued a warrant for any of the society's members. In effect, the society was the government. The government was the society. And the ledger was the accounting of their work. But there is more to the ledger than names and payments. There are also the annotations, cryptic remarks that Beckwith sometimes added to the entries. Satisfied, he would write, or done. Sometimes he wrote a single letter, G or E or P. These letters are almost certainly the initials of the men who carried out the murders, the executioners, the ones who had done the actual killing. The society was careful to separate the planners from the doers. The planners, men like Beckwith, were never present at the murders. They gave the orders, they recorded the payments, but they did not pull the trigger. That was left to a shadowy group of younger men, the ones who needed the money or who were simply hungry for the thrill of violence. The letters are their only trace, their only mark on the historical record. We do not know who they were. We will probably never know. The ledger also reveals something else, the extent of the society's reach. The victims were not all from Carter County. Some were from neighboring counties, places like Shannon and Oregon and Ripley. The society had established connections with similar groups in those counties, and they sometimes shared information and sometimes shared targets. The society's activities were part of a broader network, a shadow government that stretched across the Ozarks, enforcing its will through fear and violence. The Bald Knobbers in Taney County are the most famous of these groups, but they were not the only ones. In Christian County, a similar vigilante organization had emerged, and it had been just as brutal. In 1888, the government finally moved against them, and 5 of the leaders were hanged. But those trials were the exception, not the rule. The society in Carter County was never exposed, never prosecuted, never even investigated. The ledger is the only evidence that they existed at all. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. Because the society did not simply disband when the violence ended. The men who had led it went on to become the county's most respected citizens. They served in the legislature, held office, donated money for the construction of new buildings. They were honored in their old age, praised for their public service, their contributions to the community. The murders they had ordered were forgotten, or they were remembered only as the unfortunate but necessary consequences of a chaotic time. The society's methods were not unique to Carter County. Similar vigilante groups operated across the South, often with the direct encouragement of local governments. In the decades after the Civil War, a new kind of terrorism emerged, one that targeted not just African Americans, but anyone who challenged the power of the white elite. In Arkansas, the Brooks-Baxter War of 1874 had shown the fragility of Republican rule. In 1876, the state would fall to the Democrats, who were determined to restore their control by any means necessary. The society in Carter County was part of that larger movement, a local expression of a national backlash. The victims of the society were not all white. The ledger includes the names of at least 3 African American men, freedmen who had moved to the county after the war and who had tried to claim the rights that the Constitution promised them. They were killed, presumably, because they had had the audacity to believe that the promises of Reconstruction were real. One of them, a man named Samuel Jones, had purchased a plot of land and had filed a claim with the federal government for protection against the local authorities. That protection never came. In 1881, his cabin burned down, and he was found dead in the ashes. The coroner ruled it an accident. The ledger lists his name under the entry for that date, Samuel Jones, fire. The payment is $50. What happened to Orville Beckwith in the years after the society disbanded? He lived out his life in the same quiet way he had always lived it. He continued to operate his store, though the business was never as prosperous as it had been in the 1880s. He lost his wife in 1889, lost his children to illness and accident. He died alone in 1891, at the age of 48, and was buried in a plot that has since been paved over for a parking lot. His gravestone, if he ever had one, is gone. But the ledger survived. And it tells a story that the official histories do not tell, the story of a community that was built on murder, of a society that was governed by terror, of a system of violence that was both routine and deeply hidden. It is not a story that the county's boosters would like to hear. It is not a story that the descendants of the society's members would like to acknowledge. But it is the truth, and the truth has a way of surviving, even when it is buried under a floorboard in a forgotten building. The discovery of the ledger raises a question that is as relevant today as it was in the 19th century. How do we know what we know? The official record says one thing. The ledger says another. The official record is neat, orderly, consistent. The ledger is messy, human, flawed. But which one is closer to the truth? The answer, I think, is that the truth lies somewhere in between, in the gaps between the records, in the silences that the official histories leave behind. In the case of Carter County, the ledger has forced a reassessment of everything we thought we knew. The local histories, written by the descendants of the society's members, had always presented the violence of the period as the unavoidable consequence of frontier lawlessness. But the ledger shows something different, a carefully orchestrated campaign of terror, organized and funded by the very people who were supposed to be the guardians of law and order. The violence was not spontaneous, it was planned. The victims were not criminals, they were obstacles. The society was not a group of well-meaning men trying to restore order, it was a criminal enterprise, operating with impunity because it had the support of the powerful. We may never know the full story of the society. The ledger is incomplete, there are gaps, pages that have been torn out, entries that have been deliberately obscured. Some of the victims may have been buried in unmarked graves, their identities forever lost. Some of the members may have taken their secrets to the grave. But the ledger is enough to tell us that something terrible happened, something that the official histories have been silent about for more than a century. And that silence is not accidental. It has been carefully maintained, generation after generation, by people who had something to hide. The ledger is a crack in that silence, a glimpse into a world that has been deliberately buried. But it is only a glimpse. The full story, I suspect, is even darker than the ledger suggests. Consider the case of Mary Beth Crenshaw again. She was 19 years old when she disappeared. She was walking home from a church social, on a road that passed by the house of a wealthy merchant named Ezekiel Henson. Henson had been known to express an interest in her, but she had been unwilling to accept his advances. On the night of September 12, 1884, she was last seen walking past the gate of his property. The next morning, her body was found in a shallow grave behind the smokehouse. The coroner ruled it a homicide. But no one was ever charged. Henson had an alibi, provided by his servants. And the community, by and large, accepted it. She was just a girl, after all, and her family had no power. The ledger records the payment, $75, paid on September 15, 1884. The notation is P, which is likely Henson's initial. The ledger is clear as anything in the record. But the official records, the ones that were published at the time, say that the cause of death was unknown. And that is what the history books have repeated, for 140 years. The ledger is a correction to the record. But it is a correction that has not yet been fully absorbed by the community. This is not just a story about Carter County. It is a story about America. About the way we remember, and the way we forget. About the people who are written out of history, and the people who do the writing. The ledger is a reminder that the official record is not always the truth, that the voices of the dead have a way of making themselves heard, even when they are buried in a forgotten box in a dusty archive. It is a reminder that history is not a simple story, but a contest over who is remembered and who is forgotten, over what is said and what is left unsaid, over the meaning of the past and its place in the present. The Society's last act, as far as we know, came in 1889. In January of that year, 5 men were hanged in the Christian County Courthouse Square, the leaders of the Bald Knobbers, finally caught, finally tried, finally executed. The event was covered by newspapers across the state. It was a symbol, an assertion that the law was finally in control, that the vigilantes had been vanquished. In Carter County, the Society's members breathed a sigh of relief. They had escaped the hangman. They would continue to live in peace. But the ledger, hidden in the store, was a ticking bomb. If anyone had found it, if anyone had known what it contained, the Society's members would have been in grave danger. As it happened, Beckwith died before he could destroy it. And the ledger survived, waiting for Harley Ponder to discover it, waiting for Margaret Stubblefield to understand it. It has waited more than a century to tell its story. What does the ledger tell us about the victims? Not much, really. It tells us their names, their dates, the amounts paid for their deaths. But it does not tell us who they were, their hopes, their dreams, their families. It does not tell us what they thought in their final moments, or whether they knew who was killing them, or what they had done to deserve it. The ledger is a cold document, a record of transactions, and it gives no more detail than is necessary for accounting purposes. It is a testament to the poverty of bureaucratic violence, the reduction of human beings to line items in a book. But we can imagine. We can imagine Elijah Pugh's wife, Caroline, waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of men's voices, looking out the window, seeing her husband being marched away. We can imagine her running after them, begging for his life, being turned away with a threat. We can imagine her searching for him the next morning, finding his body in the woods, knowing in her heart that no one would ever be punished for his murder. We can imagine her writing that letter to the governor, the letter that was ignored. We can imagine her years later, old and poor, still wondering why her husband had to die. The ledger does not tell us her story. But the ledger is what makes her story possible, in a way. It is evidence, the only evidence that exists, that her husband did not die for nothing, that there was a reason for his death, even if that reason was a matter of accounting. It is a fragment of justice, long delayed, but not entirely absent. The final haunting question, the one that lingers after the ledger has been read and the names have been counted, is this: what would you have done? If you had lived in Carter County in the 1880s, if you had known what was happening, would you have spoken out? Would you have risked your life to save a neighbor? Or would you have kept your head down, hoping that the terror would pass you by, hoping that your family would not be the next name in the ledger? The question is not an easy one, and it applies not only to the past but to the present, to every moment when we are confronted with injustice and have to decide whether to act. The ledger is a mirror, and when we look into it, we see not only the names of the dead but also our own faces, our own choices, our own fears. It is a reminder that history is not something that happens to us. It is something we make, every day, through the decisions we make and the decisions we refuse to make. The ledger is a testament to the cost of silence, the price of complicity, the weight of the past that we carry with us into the future. And so we return to the beginning. The discovery of the ledger, in the summer of 1978, in a demolished building in Van Buren, Missouri. It was a chance discovery, almost accidental. If Harley Ponder had not been curious, if he had not pulled the pages apart, the ledger might still be there, rotting away in a forgotten foundation. But he did pull them apart. And what he found was a record of atrocity. He did not know what he had found, not at first. But he kept it. He saved it. And eventually, it came to light. That is the nature of history, a chance discovery, a forgotten document, a single piece of evidence that changes everything. Or almost everything. Because even with the ledger, the truth is still elusive. We have the names, the dates, the payments. But we do not have the full story. We do not know the victims as people. We do not know the killers as people either. We have only the cold record. And that is not enough. The ledger does not answer the final question. It only gives us the material to ask it. And so we ask. And we will keep asking, because that is what history is, an endless process of asking questions, of demanding answers, of refusing to let the dead be forgotten. The ledger is our tool. The names are our clue. And the silence of the past is the challenge we must face. Orville F. Beckwith is dead. The society is gone. But the ledger remains, and it tells the story that was meant to be hidden.